studying together on Hanukkah. I don't think we've ever had the opportunity to have a class on Hanukkah, so I think it's quite special. And we're going to look at some of the meaning and the significance behind the events that took place and what that can teach us and how that can give us a new perspective on the way we approach Judaism. So I'll start with the story of a grandma who was on the phone with her grandson, Joey. She was inviting him to join them for the grand annual Hanukkah party that everybody was looking forward to. And she is giving him instructions. She says, okay, so you'll come to the front door and you'll ring the bell with your elbow. And of course, I'll buzz you in, and then you'll come inside, go down the hall till you get to the elevator, push the button with your elbow. When you get inside the elevator, again, you need to use your elbow to push the button. It will be in number 4. And when you get up to the 4th floor, make a right. I'm at the end of the hall, and you can knock on the door with your elbow. I'm curious what you're all thinking right now, but I'm going to tell you how the story continues. So Joey says, Grandma, that sounds great. I'm so excited. I'm looking forward to the party. I just have one question. Why do I need to do everything with my elbow? So his grandmother replies in astonishment, what do you mean? You're not bringing me any gifts? So when I heard this joke not too long ago, and I was hearing all about the elbow, I was thinking, well, you know, she wants him to avoid any germs from COVID. But I think that this joke is a lot older than COVID. And of course, we know that Hanukkah parties are something that many families try to plan and enjoy doing together. It's an opportunity to have everyone come together, enjoy some good food, some family time, to light the candles. And it's just something very special. So we're going to start with the piece in the Talmud, which speaks about what happened on Hanukkah and why we are celebrating. I'm going to share the text with you so that you can read it along with me. Let me just find it over here. Sorry, give me a moment. Okay, here goes. So interestingly, the telling over of what happened on at the time of Hanukkah, there isn't very much written in the sources. It's not like the story of Purim, where there's an entire scroll of Esther, for example, or Passover, where we have the whole account in the Torah. There's just, you know, much shorter sources which tell us about this. And here in the Talmud, it's not even in its own Hanukkah section. It's sort of placed in the middle of Masechet Shabbat, Tractate Shabbat, and this is what the sages discussed. So, when the Greeks entered the sanctuary, they contaminated all of its oil. When the royal Hasmonean family overpowered and was victorious over them, they searched and found only a single cruse of pure oil that was sealed with the seal of the Kohen Gadol, the high priest, enough to light the menorah for a single day. A miracle occurred, and they lit the menorah with this oil for 8 days. The following year, they established these 8 days as days of festivity and praise and thanksgiving to God. So it's very short, very concise, and if we look more closely at it, we'll notice that in the Talmud, they're focusing very much on what took place at the end of the story, really, when the family of the Hashmonaim, the Hasmoneans, arrived back at the temple. They had overpowered the Greek army after a few years of fierce battle. They wanted to kindle the menorah. They had to find some oil, and the only pure oil they found was one jug, which was enough for one day. And God made a miracle. They lit the menorah as usual with this one jug of oil, and instead of burning as usual for one day, it actually burned for 8 days. So it's interesting that the Talmud seems to mention the military victory only in passing, because really it was quite significant. I mean, you have the Greek army, vast, mighty warriors, very experienced. And then you have this tiny band of Jews, really not trained in any sort of military strategy, fighting against this massive power. It took a few years. It took about 3 years, 3 or 4 years. The Talmud does mention it to sort of give us some context, but doesn't go into much detail at all. The big focus, the big deal seems to be the arrival to the temple, finding that one small jug of oil and lighting the menorah, and the miracle of the 8 days of it burning. So that's an interesting question that we're going to look at tonight. We're also going to look at Hanukkah and the way that it compares to the other Jewish holidays throughout the year. If we look through all the festivals, we obviously each one has its specific idea or event that it's commemorating or symbolizing, with its customs and its focus. But there are some elements that are very common in each of the holidays. One very obvious one is that we have festive meals, and it's considered part of the mitzvah of the holiday to hold that festive meal. So for example, Passover, for example, has a very grand meal, the Seder. On Purim, there's 4 specific mitzvot of the day, and one of them is specifically a feast. Even on Yom Kippur, which itself is a fast day, the day before, the eve of the day preceding Yom Kippur is supposed to be a day where we have festive meals, and it's said that somebody who rejoices and has a beautiful meal, or 2 meals really, on the day before Yom Kippur is considered as if he's fasted both on Erev Yom Kippur and on Yom Kippur itself. And then, of course, following the fast, we then again go and celebrate by eating a meal, because we're showing joy and confidence that God has accepted our prayers and our repentance. If we look at the holiday of Hanukkah, yes, there definitely are foods associated with the holiday. I don't think that there could be a Jewish festival that doesn't have a special food, or more than one related to it. That's just the way that we celebrate. We have the donuts, we have the latkes with sufganiyot, fried foods. However, it is not an obligation to eat them. And if a person goes through the entire holiday of Hanukkah and doesn't taste a single fried food, as long as they've kindled the candles of the menorah each night, 1, 2, 3, and so on until 8, that's the observance of the holiday of Hanukkah, of the festival. So it seems that Hanukkah has a very spiritual element, which is different from all the other festivals that we observe throughout the rest of the year. Now, of course, the other festivals have a lot of spiritual, rich, deep meaning behind them as well. Just to take 2 examples, Passover and Purim. On Passover, the Jewish people were extracted from the depths of corruption and immorality of the Egyptian nation, and they were brought to a level where they were able to receive the Torah and enter into a brit, into a covenant with God. Purim, when Haman threatened to annihilate the Jewish people and kill them all. Yes, there was a physical threat to their life. He wanted to get rid of them. But what was his motivation? What did he say to the king, Ahasuerus? He said, this is a nation that has strange laws. They're different from us. They do things differently, and I want to get rid of them. So there was that spiritual identity of the Jew was the reason why he came up with his plan to begin with. So again, you have this very spiritual component. But also you have the very physical threat to life that took place during these times. As I just mentioned with Haman, and obviously during the time of the slavery in Egypt, the Torah tells us how Pharaoh killed babies and oppressed the Jews in terrible ways. Their lives were not worth very much. So there was very physical threat to the Jewish people's lives. If we look at the story of Chanukah, however, and we look at the Greeks and what they were trying to do, it's interesting to see that they actually were not specifically looking to kill Jews. That wasn't their mission. They were very happy to embrace the Jews, to draw them into their culture. Specifically, during the time of Antiochus, who is the king under which the story of Chanukah took place, he wanted the Greeks to spread the ideas of Hellenism, of glorifying the body, of physical and athletic prowess, beauty, all of these ideas. He wanted to encourage the Jewish people to embrace them and to assimilate into the Greek culture. Even the Jewish culture and the Jewish study and ideas, the Greeks didn't necessarily look to get rid of them completely. There were specific things, there were specific observances that were targeted. But as a whole, there were things that the Greeks were happy to take from the Jewish people. When they came to Jerusalem and they established their power, they did not destroy the temple. The Babylonians destroyed the first temple, the Romans destroyed the second temple. The Greeks did not do that. In fact, when they came to Jerusalem, they built gymnasiums and stadiums, they built other temples, they made it beautiful. They really tried to enhance and make it much grander. So what was the threat? What was the danger that the Greeks posed? There were three main things that the Greeks, that Antiochus the king, decreed against and forbade the Jews from fulfilling. Number one was Brit Milah, circumcision. Number two was Shabbat. And number three was Rosh Chodesh, which is where we declare and mark the beginning of the new month. And actually, the word, when we wish each other Chag Sameach, the word Sameach is Sin Mem Chet. Now, Sin and Shin are actually the same letter. They look the same. They just have a slightly different voweling. So that stands for Shabbat. Mem stands for Milah, which means circumcision. And Chet is Chodesh, which is the month. So Chag Sameach, we're wishing each other a happy, joyous holiday because we are declaring how the Greeks did not succeed in their plans. Why specifically these three things? Because these three things identified Jews as being separate, as being different, as being distinct from other nations. With the circumcision, it would be the Jew being different with their body. With Shabbat, that they have a special day where they don't work, where they rest. Now it's very accepted, as we've spoken about over the course of our Shabbat classes. But in those times, there wasn't such a thing as 6 days and 6 days of work week, 7-day rest. You know, the ancient nations didn't necessarily believe in that kind of cycle. And then the months is, again, the Jewish people, instead of following the same calendar as everybody else, we're on a different calendar. For the nations of the world, today is whatever the English date is, and the Jewish people have their own date. So what exactly is going on over here? What is the issue that the Greeks have? What is their agenda, and what are they trying to prevent or remove or erase? What the Greeks wanted to do was they wanted to take the holiness and the godliness out of Judaism. They were happy to take the parts of Jewish culture and Jewish observance that made sense. Things that promote family, community, self-actualization, activism. Things that make life beautiful, enjoyable, wonderful. But once you start getting into things of, into ideas of holiness, or things that the Jewish people kept that were not necessarily able to be explained in rational thought, then they had a problem. They said, you know, learn the Torah, study its wisdom. It's a wonderful book. There's a lot of beauty and wisdom in it. But don't start saying that you're studying it because it's God's Torah, because it's holy, because there's something lofty and spiritual about it. We actually see that the Torah, the first time that it was translated into another language it was translated into Greek, because they appreciated the wisdom of the Torah. But again, they wanted to take out the holiness. They wanted to take out God from inside of it. And that is very clearly expressed by what they did when they came to the temple and they desecrated it. They did not destroy it. They were not looking to get rid of it. It's beautiful. Have a wonderful temple. You can do beautiful rituals in it. Lighting a menorah is very special. It's candles. It warms people's hearts. It's beautiful. But what did they do? They took the oil. They didn't spill out the oil and make it impossible to use. All they did was they took the jugs, which were originally made to the highest standards of purity according to Jewish law, because that's the way that the service of lighting the menorah was supposed to take place. And they removed the seals, which contaminated and defiled the oil and rendered it impure, made it unfit to be used for lighting the menorah in the temple. So again, why does the oil need to be pure? I mean, producing olive oil goes through a certain process. Pure oil and impure oil go through the same physical process to go from being deep inside the olive to being a bottle or a jar of oil that you can use for kindling or for cooking or for anything else. What makes something pure or impure? It's something that's completely beyond human rationale. It's a concept that God created, and God made certain parameters, a certain framework. This is the way that something becomes and remains pure. This is the way that something becomes defiled and impure. It's not something that we can understand on a physical level. So the act of the Greeks coming to the temple and defiling the oil symbolized and showed their agenda, which was, here, take your oil, light the menorah. But we don't want the holiness in there. We don't want the godliness in there. We don't understand this idea where you're going to where your service of God And your observance of Judaism is going to be connected to something that is beyond intellect and beyond understanding. And this is specifically why the Talmud does not focus on the battle. Of course, the battle was necessary, but the main threat and danger was this spiritual threat. And the way that the Greeks wanted to remove the holiness from Judaism. And overcoming that and being victorious and preventing them from fulfilling their agenda is represented not by the battle, but rather by the fact that the Jewish people persevered. They did not use the oil that was impure. They searched and they searched until they found a jug of oil. And of course, God rewarded and recognized the fact that they were reaching towards him in a way of saying, our connection with you goes beyond logic. It goes beyond understanding, and caused the miracle to happen where the oil burned for 8 days instead of the 1 day that it should have. And we actually see this in the numbers themselves. And I think this is actually a very appropriate segue from our class on Shabbat. Because in Kabbalah and Jewish mysticism, the number 7 represents the natural order of the world. 7 days in a week, the natural cycle, the way that things function according to the laws of nature. Number 8, which is above 7, represents when we go beyond the laws of nature and something breaks the nature, something supernatural happens. Like the example of the oil, which we all know that according to the laws of nature, a limited amount of oil burns for a limited amount of time. And God made that oil burn 8 times longer than it was supposed to. In the prayers, we read this in the grace after meals. We add it during the days of Chanukah and also in the Amidah. We thank God for the wonders and the miracles that he did for us during the time of Chanukah. And one of the way that it's expressed in that prayer, it describes what the Greeks were trying to do to the Jews. And it says that they wanted lahashkicham toratecha, to make them forget your Torah. Lahaviram mechokei ritzonecha, to take the Jews away from fulfilling the chukim, the laws of your will. Why the emphasis on your Torah, God's Torah, on your commandments, God's commandments? Because again, it wasn't necessarily the wisdom of the Torah that they were against. It wasn't necessarily that they didn't want the Jewish people to fulfill certain traditions, but when they were so strongly associated with the Jews humbling themselves before God and accepting that we are doing this because this is what God has asked from us, that is where they had the problem, and that was what they were trying to annihilate. In fact, the word chok, from chokei ritzonecha, the word chok, refers specifically to a commandment which doesn't really have a rational explanation. It's a godly rationale that we are not able to understand. Now, if we look at the different laws of the Torah, there's different categories. There are those laws that seem very rational and that we would probably have come up with ourselves without God having commanded us. Those like don't kill, don't steal, love your fellow, look out for the downtrodden, for the orphans, right? All those kinds of laws. They're very logical and rational, and we would like to be people who follow those kinds of laws. Then you have laws that are testimonies. They recall certain events. So we have Shabbat, which recalls the creation of the world. We have the holidays. We remember being released from Egypt, the miracle of Purim, and so on, each for its particular holiday. And then we have chukim, we have commandments that, while we can try and find a way to make them meaningful for ourselves in our lives, that's not really the true reason why God has given them to us, and they remain largely not understood. For example, the laws of keeping kosher. Why are certain things kosher and other things are not? Why, if I have two kosher items, kosher to the highest standards of kosher, but one is meat and one is milk, and I mix them together, suddenly that's not kosher? There's a lot that's not really able to be explained. And when we fulfill a commandment like that, we are clearly demonstrating that it's simply because God has asked us to do that. And our connection with God is not only limited to what we can understand or to what we feel enhances our lives, but our connection to God also goes far beyond that. It's not limited. There's a story, this took place probably in the 1960s, if I'm not mistaken, of a certain professor by the name of Professor Velvel Green. He was a very well-known personality in the field of science. He dealt with numerous complex scientific areas and fields. At the time, I think he was working for NASA to see if to try and discover if there's any living things on the moon. And he was specifically working in what he was doing was so up there that he was working in sort of this base where there was top security and people needed clearance if they wanted to come see him. He was from Minnesota, and at that time, the Rebbe had begun sending out emissaries to different Jewish communities to bring Jewish services and ideas and meaning to people who were not necessarily very connected with their Judaism, whether by choice or whether just because of the way that they had grown up. And there was a young fellow who actually had grown up himself in Minnesota and had become a rabbi and was now being sent by the Lubavitch Rebbe there to be an emissary, to become a rabbi and to establish a Jewish community there. His name was Rabbi Moshe Feller. He's a very feisty personality, very determined. And he arrived in Minnesota and he was trying to figure out how is he going to reach the local community? How is he going to begin activities? How is he going to connect? When an emissary is sent out or goes out to a community, they're not given a list of steps to follow and exact things to do. They're charged with a general mission, and each couple is supposed to look at the needs of the particular area where they are sent and try and figure out the best way for them to be of service to that particular community. So when he arrives in Minnesota, he's speaking to some people and everybody's telling him, if you want to be able to reach the community, you need to get in touch with Velvel Green. He's very influential. Everybody looks up to him over here. If you've reached him, you'll be able to make progress and have influence on everybody else. Now, of course, based on the way I've just described him, you can understand that he was extremely busy, very highly in demand, and not necessarily able to just see any person who felt like contacting him. But Rabbi Feller was very determined, and he kept pushing and calling and trying to get this number and that number and calling his wife. Finally, he manages to procure an appointment after months of effort with this professor. The professor was originally under the impression that he was just looking to, that Rabbi Feller was just looking to raise funds for his synagogue or for his projects, but that was not what Rabbi Feller was after. And he arrives at Professor Green's office after going through security clearance, and they start talking and having a discussion. And Rabbi Feller explains to him why he's in Minnesota, and Professor Green is starting to give him advice. He says, first of all, maybe you should change the color shirt that you're wearing. Maybe if you wear a yellow shirt and you don't wear black suit, you look a bit more. And this is the kind of advice he's giving to the rabbi, which is obviously wasn't really what Rabbi Feller was looking for. And the conversation is continuing, and they're trying to get somewhere, but they seem to be on completely different paths, and they're not really, their minds are not really meeting. And at one point, and they're getting into an argument about something, and at one point, Professor Green looks into a book to look something up in order to be able to back up whatever argument he was making. So he's looking for a few minutes in this book, and he looks up, and to his utter surprise, he sees this young rabbi standing in the corner of his office. He's taken out this little belt and put it around his waist, and he's standing in the corner of the office, and he's swaying back and forth, and he's praying the afternoon prayer. Professor Green is in complete shock, and he's upset and angry. What's this supposed to be? He's making himself, he's just doing whatever he wants over here in my office. Anyway, he waits for the rabbi to finish praying. The rabbi finishes, and the meeting ends, and it doesn't seem to have been very successful or pleasant. But after the rabbi leaves, the professor is thinking about what took place. And he's thinking about the way the rabbi got up to pray. And his attitude changes completely. He thinks to himself, this young rabbi, he has a mission. He has something that he's trying to, a certain initiative, project that he's trying to get off the ground. He's new in town. Nobody knows him. He doesn't have any reputation behind him that people will back him up for yet. He's just arrived. He needs me. I'm the important person here. I'm the professor, the influencer. But that doesn't stop him from following what his convictions are. It came the time for him to pray. And even though he had waited months for this appointment, and he had worked so hard to be able to speak to me, and he needs me, that didn't change what he was doing and how he was behaving. The time for praying the afternoon prayer was going to pass once it would get dark. He saw he's going to miss the opportunity, and he just got up without thinking, and he did the prayer as usual. Professor Green calls up his wife. He says, we had this conversation last week about Abraham and how Abraham lived his life for God. And we decided together that there's no such thing as a Jew who lives his life for God anymore. They don't exist these days. Well, guess what? I've just met such a Jew. He was so impressed with this display of somebody following their convictions, even when it didn't make sense, and even when it could have put his mission in jeopardy. And that changed his opinion completely. He became very close with Rabbi Feller and was eventually influenced by him in a great way, and became very involved in Judaism. So we can talk about Judaism, we could talk about the beauty of it, how much it enhances our lives, the rich spiritual meaning that it has, why it makes sense for us to do this or that or the other. And it's all true. And it's all part of Judaism. But of course, this only goes so far. It only reaches a certain extent, a certain degree. But there's a deeper level, there's a higher level, there's a further realm, which in order to get there, we have to go beyond what we can understand, beyond the things that strictly make sense to us. And those things can move people in a way that eloquent arguments might not necessarily have an impact. I'm going to share with you a conversation written up by a well-known, by a Chabad rabbi who writes and speaks a lot about the Kabbalah and Jewish mysticism and philosophy, and tries to take it and bring it down and make it very, very contemporary. So this is in the middle of the conversation. I can't read you the whole thing right now. It's very long. If you'd like to see the whole article, I'm happy to send it to you, but I'm just going to read this part to you. So it's a conversation between the soul and the body, okay? So S is soul, B is body. Hey, body, I have to tell you something. B, not interested. S, it's a story, a personal story. B, body, that it needs potato chips and violence and romance. Soul, it has all of that. You see, before I came here, I was in the highest place in the universe. It's called the Garden of Eden, and it goes higher and higher. And I was like at level 3100 and moving up. There you don't have TV. You've got way better. You get to bask in the rays of the light from the Shekhinah. The Shekhinah is God's lofty presence. In perfect bliss and ecstasy, as that light constantly increases its intensity as you increase your capacity to absorb. So the soul is describing how God's light obviously is completely infinite and becomes more and more intense. And as the soul moves up from level to level, it's able to absorb more and more of this. And the spiritual delight is just indescribable. So the body asks, being the body, what's there to eat? Soul, eat? Souls stand in line for years to get to these places. There's no restaurant, entertainment, or amusement park anywhere close to this. Returning souls are willing to suffer the fires of Gehenna for years just to get a back seat to the show. Souls that come back from this world that are willing to go through very difficult spiritual experiences in order to be able to get a glimpse of these things. I'm telling you, a lifetime of every pleasure this world has to offer doesn't come close to one moment of delight of that world. So the body asks the obvious question, so how on earth did you end up down here then? The soul, that's where the violence comes in. Body's curious. I'm listening. I was violently ripped away from my true place above in that divine light and thrown down here below to be imprisoned within. Body, yours truly. Thanks a lot. Listen, if you didn't want to be here, you didn't have to consent. The soul, I was forced against my will. Body, but admit it, you weren't interested, right? Otherwise, sure, I was interested. Okay, let's just skip a little bit. No, really, I knew it was a gamble, but I figured, hey, maybe there's a chance. Body, a chance of what? A chance to get even higher. So I took the gamble. What was the gamble? So the soul says, there in the upper worlds, I was going higher and higher without end. So the soul says, yeah. So I said, I got to get beyond this. I got to get to the source where all this light is coming from, the real essence. So the body is confused. What's that? The soul, he himself, not just Garden of Eden, not just light, not even infinite light, the absolute. B, a body. Cool. So how do you get it? Soul, well, I figured I can't get it on my own because you see, I'm a being of light. Wherever I go, wherever I look, there's just light. No real beingness, no real sense of, hey, I am here. To get to the absolute, the core and essence, I need to invest in something that has that drive, that need to be something, that sense of I, because how can you experience the ultimate true I if you don't have an I yourself? Okay, I'm going to explain this because it's obviously quite a bit abstract, but I'm going to take one side of it. So obviously the soul is describing these intense, spiritual, lofty, never-ending levels of spiritual bliss and ecstasy that the soul is able to reach. And it's wonderful and dramatic and exciting and never ending, and the soul can never satiate its enjoyment of this kind of spiritual ecstasy. But as the rabbi describes in this cute dialogue that he wrote, you'll go higher and higher to loftier and loftier levels, but it's all God's light. It's God's glory. But what about God himself? How do we reach the essence, the source within from where all that light comes? It might sound counterintuitive, but it's possible to get very lost in spiritual and uplifting experiences and not actually reach God himself. The way that we reach God himself is down here in this physical world when we do a physical mitzvah, whatever it might be, because God himself is invested in that, in physicality. So one of the things about this physical world, which is completely different from all the other spiritual worlds, is that this physical world has ego in it. Everything that exists calls out, I exist, to the extent that it's covering over God. And while that I can and often is very negative, on the flip side, it's indicative of something so deep and so lofty. This world is not coming from God's light and God's radiance. This physical world is coming from God's essence, from his being. And since God is the ultimate I, the ultimate something, the ultimate existence, so of course, a world that comes from that kind of source has within it the characteristic of I, of ego, of existence. Now, obviously, the challenge is to take it from the negative direction and focus it in a godly and positive direction. But there's something very, very deep over here. I'm going to share a video clip with you. I wonder, some of you may have seen this. This was an experiment set up by a writer for the Washington Post a few years back, who then wrote an article about it. And this is the video. Let me just, okay. So we have a violinist by the name of Joshua Bell, very famous, extremely talented. He plays a Stradivarius. I think it's valued at $3.5 million. And they did an experiment to see if he plays in a subway station with some coins in a container in front of him, will people appreciate his music the same way that they do when they come to enjoy one of his concerts. So let's look at a quick video. So you can see how he's playing very diligently, very beautifully, real talent, real beauty. But he's standing in a subway station in rush hour in Washington. He's wearing a baseball cap, some simple clothes. He's got his violin case open with some coins and dollar bills in front of him. He played for 45 minutes. Just over 1,000 people walked by in those 45 minutes. 7 people stopped to listen to him. And a bunch of children who were pulled impatiently by their parents who were trying to go in whichever direction they were rushing to. 3 days before that, he held a concert in the Boston Symphony Hall. It was packed. Seats were at minimum $100 for a seat. So what is it that over here he's standing in a subway station and people are barely looking in his direction? And when they do, perhaps it's out of pity to throw him a few coins. Now, if you think about going to hear a famous musician play in concert, so of course the experience is different when you plan for a few months in advance, you bought your tickets, you get dressed up, you come to this beautiful ornate hall, you sink into a comfortable plush seat, and you're there to enjoy a spectacular concert performance. It's a completely different experience to just standing in a subway station on a cold winter morning and listening to the same individual play. But the question is, are we getting too caught up in and distracted by the trappings, that when those trappings are no longer there, even if the real talent and person himself is there, we don't even realize, and we don't even cast him a glance? It doesn't make his talent, it doesn't make the beauty of the music any less beautiful, any less real talent. And I think this is a good analogy for the idea that we were just talking about. Yes, of course, we want to be able to involve all our senses in our Jewish observance. And we should. It should be an immersive, integrative, all-encompassing experience wherever possible. It enhances the observances. And not only does it enhance the observances, but the effect of what we're doing can penetrate all parts of us instead of remaining limited to one area. But we need to remember what's that real thing behind everything. We need to remember the holiness. We need to remember the God that's inside it all. Because sometimes it's easy to get distracted by the details and to forget what it's really all about, where this is all supposed to be heading, what's the essence that it all comes from. And really, if we think about it, the fact that Judaism and the Jewish people has endured for so long, there's something inside everything that doesn't change. It's a very deep essence, and it's able to endure through changes in circumstances, changes in time, changes in culture, geography. When something can last for so long, through so many different years, through so many different challenges, different types of people, different geographic locations, there's got to be something very true and very, very real about it. So I think that one of the messages that we can take from Chanukah is that while we are doing whatever it is that we are doing, in making ourselves better people, in contributing to the world, in lifting ourselves up by fulfilling a mitzvah. It's rooted in that deep, ultimate connection with God that goes beyond rational explanation. And that's what's able to give it its stability and able to give it its endurance. And we are then able to take that power and strength and draw whatever it is that the particular endeavor offers into our lives to uplift ourselves and to uplift the people around us. So we have 2 more days of Hanukkah, because we have tonight, which is the 7th night, and then we have tomorrow night, which is the 8th night, and continues into Friday. And obviously on the 8th night, on the 8th day, we are not only commemorating the miracle that the oil burned for the 8 days, but it's also the 8th day, which symbolizes going beyond nature, going beyond the natural order. And while we have the ability to celebrate this holiday by lighting the candles, and as is said, we're supposed to sit and look at the candles and listen to the message that the candles are telling us and the stories that they are relating. Hanukkah doesn't end when the holiday ends. Hanukkah, the holiday is an opportunity really for us to take from this reservoir of energy. It's a strong, potent energy that's present during the festival of Hanukkah. And we believe this about all the holidays in its particular message and symbolism. And by focusing and meditating and absorbing as much as we can from this spiritual reservoir, we then can take that energy and we can carry the message and carry the perspective with us over the days and the months to come. So I hope that there's something that you can take from what we've discussed tonight. I hope that the discussion about the oil and the miracle and the Greeks' intents and motivation has been enlightening for you. And of course, most importantly, the message of light in the darkness is always a very powerful one for everybody at every stage. And we should all be able to continue seeing, as we increase the light from 1 candle to 8 through Hanukkah, the light should just keep on increasing for each and every one of us in our personal lives and for the world at large. I am going